So we're going to get. And Diane, you're welcome to leave your video on or off, up to you, when you're presenting. I think it's an active speaker mode, so whoever's speaking while like their video will be showing up.
Okay, so if I minimize, will it still be showing?
If you say stop video, then you would no longer be showing your video.
Okay.
But you can just leave yours on. That doesn't really matter. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to give a minute for folks to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It's nice to see some familiar names in the participant window. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Corinne. I work in the College of Engineering. I'm part of this team that is putting on this exciting case competition, as well as one of the organizers of Climate Year at Drexel and at the Academy. Climate Year just kicked off this month and runs through the rest of 2021. It's a year for us to take inventory of all of the climate action taking place in every corner of the university, so we can come together to elevate our commitment to the climate crisis. We have many other activities throughout the year, so I'll put a link to Climate Year, the Climate Year webpage in the chat in a minute, so you can see how you can get involved in the activities we have planned this year. One way that we're having students take action is by helping us solve the problem posed in this very case competition, which is how to reduce our reliance on single-use plastic amid the COVID-19 pandemic. As we have all seen, single-use plastic has been on the rise as people fear COVID transmission from reusable dining ware. Yet we are all here because we know there is significant environmental harm from the overuse of single-use plastics. I don't know about you, but when I think about the environmental harm of single-use plastics, my mind immediately goes to the oceans. I think about the massive plastic waste accumulating in the oceans and it getting stuck in animals' digestive systems and so on. There is good reason for that. I think about where it goes because I see plastic on the streets, on riverbanks, on the beaches, and I see pictures like this of plastic waste all of the time. But where it comes from is just as important as where it ends up and has very strong links to environmental injustice, as Dr. Sicotte is going to tell us about, and it also has very strong links to climate change. Plastic typically is derived from oil or gas. Every part of the life cycle of plastic, from extraction to the end of life, which is typically incineration, requires a lot of energy, which is largely also dependent on fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. The drilling and then the transport of, for example, natural gas requires energy and fuel and is prone to leaking, releasing methane, a particularly potent greenhouse gas, straight into the atmosphere. The facilities that transform oil and gas into plastic undergo an intensive industrial process to create plastic. That manufacturing process in 2015 was the carbon equivalent to emissions of 45 million cars on the road. We know we depend on plastic for many things. Just look around your room right now and look at how much is made out of plastic. Most of my laptop is made out of plastic, but we certainly don't need a lot of this plastic. 40% of plastic is manufactured into single-use packaging, which is used once and thrown away. Think about a plastic fork you may pick up at, say, a cafeteria. That fork started in the ground as oil or gas, was transported to a facility to be turned into a fork, trucked to a distribution center to then be shipped to the cafeteria, probably again on a truck which runs on fossil fuels. You use that fork for, say, 30 minutes, if that fork is lucky. Then you throw it in the trash where it would likely be taken to get incinerated. Its useful life in its entire life cycle was 30 minutes. Of course, some plastic is recyclable, but only 9% of plastic has ever been recycled, and recycling itself is also an energy-intensive process. Furthermore, recycling centers worldwide are overloaded. We saw in 2019 in Philadelphia, when China stopped accepting much of the US's dirty recycling, we had to shift to incinerating our recyclables until we could find someone to take our recycling. Now it costs Philadelphia more to recycle plastics than it does to send our plastics to an incinerator. An NPR and PBS Frontline investigative story found out that the plastic industry sold the public an idea it knew it wouldn't work. The idea that the majority of plastic could be and would be recycled, all while making billions of dollars selling the world new plastics. And that industry is on a path to get worse. Cheap natural gas from fracking in the US and particularly in Pennsylvania is driving a plastic production boom, and the industry is investing hundreds of billions of dollars in plastic production. The Center for International Environmental Law projects that by 2030, emissions from every stage of the plastic life cycle will release as much carbon as 295 coal-fired power plants every year and 615 coal plants by 2050. That would account for a large chunk, about 13% of the global carbon emissions that the IPCC says we need to stay within to meet the limits of the Paris Climate Agreement. While plastic is clearly bad, I also want to caution you on alternatives. Plastic is not the only material that requires energy to produce, and in fact, a plastic bag requires less energy to produce than paper and canvas bags. A study from the UK's Environment Agency found that paper bags needed to be used 3 times and cotton bags 131 times to ensure their global warming potential is lower than a typical plastic grocery bag. So for the students that are involved in this CAMES competition, it's important to keep in mind that sometimes what you have already at home and can reuse is the best option for the climate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our featured speaker, Dr. Diane Sicotte. Dr. Sicotte is an environmental sociologist with research interests in environmental injustice and inequality. She teaches courses on environmental justice, environmental sociology, sociology of disasters, and social movements. She combines sociological research methods with geographic and historical methods to investigate the role of race and ethnicity, social class, labor, and waste disposal technologies in the development of environmental inequalities. She is currently researching issues related to natural gas extraction, including labor union members' preferences for natural gas or alternative energy sources, the connection between hydraulic fracturing and plastics production, and the role of natural gas infrastructures and technological lock-in that will ensure continued use of fossil fuel as an energy source. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Sicotte. Keep in mind that you can ask questions throughout the session by using the Q&A box, or at the end when we do Q&A, you can also raise your hand to verbally ask a question. Dr. Sicotte will be answering the questions towards the end, but feel free to submit any questions using that Q&A box for her presentation. Dr. Sicotte, you can take it away.
Thanks, Corinne. I'm going to do a screen share now. And the title of my presentation is Fracked, Cracked, and Discarded, Environmental Injustice and Plastics. So this presentation comes from a book chapter titled From Western Pennsylvania to the World, Environmental Injustice and the Ethane to Plastics Global Production Network. And this chapter is forthcoming in this year in the Routledge Handbook of the Political Economy of the Environment, edited by Eloy Laurent, who is from Sciences Po in Paris. Okay, I'm going to move this little thing on my screen, get it out of the way a little bit. Okay, so the issue is what to do with all that cheap ethane. Okay, so one of the questions that I was interested in is how did the fracking boom in North America give rise to the increased production of disposable plastic items? I think perhaps the Energy Policy Act of 2005 is familiar to all of you. It made unconventional gas drilling exempt from the Safe Drinking Water Act, which reduced the regulatory costs of unconventional drilling. So this, combined with the lower cost of the technologies ushered in a fracking boom as companies rushed to extract the gas from North America's shale rock formations. But the rush to drill produced a gas glut in 2009, causing the price of natural gas to drop sharply that year. Gas producers were finding that it was more profitable than before to separate out the gas liquid ethane from the crude gas. So ethane is a hydrocarbon used as a building block for plastics, where it is transformed into ethylene and then polyethylene. Now, ethane is a really good feedstock for gas because 80% of it transforms into ethylene, whereas if you use naphtha, only 30% transforms into naphthalene. So it's a good, cheap building block. And because the cost of raw materials is estimated to be about 60% of the cost of plastics production, the wider availability of cheap ethane boosted the profitability of plastics. Much of the ethane produced in the US comes from the Marcellus Shale, which covers western Pennsylvania. And this is particularly rich in ethane. And in 2019, the US became the world's leading exporter of ethane. So this is a diagram showing the global production network that turns ethane into plastics and through which ethane is exported to other countries. So these are just the parts of the global supply chain, from the wellhead through pipelines to a processing plant to a fractionator, also called a cracker. From there, it's either stored, exported, or manufactured into plastics. And as Corin mentioned, about 40% of these plastic resins are used to make disposable packaging and other items. So now that I've talked a little bit about the context for these conditions, I'd like to shift the focus to two different aspects of environmental injustice. The first is distributive injustice, which is when one group of people receives disproportionate harms from an environmentally risky process or technology, while a different group of people receives most of the benefits. So another way of thinking about distributive injustice is examining unequal distributions of environmentally safe, clean, and beautiful environments. A lot of people have to live in environments that are none of these things. The second aspect of environmental injustice is participative or procedural injustice. And this is when people who are impacted by something that's environmentally risky don't get to fully participate in deliberating about the rules or conditions under which this can be done or whether it can be done at all. So we can see both types of environmental injustice happening in each part of the global production network that uses ethane to produce plastics. So this is just an overview of fracking and environmental injustice. We're talking about the use of 5 million gallons of water in Pennsylvania, 15 million gallons of water in places such as Texas. And this diagram just shows a little bit about the poor conditions that people who live in fracking communities have to face. So these are pictures of people in Pennsylvania whose lives have been impacted by fracking activities. Fracking is known to pollute well water with hydrocarbons and toxic chemicals and also causes air pollution. So it's a serious threat to the people who live near wells and also the farm animals and wildlife who live near wells. For example, a 2016 study found that pregnant women near fracking activities were more likely to give birth to premature babies. Fracking may also be exposing people to endocrine disrupting chemicals, and these are in the fracking fluids, which cause abnormalities of the reproductive system infertility, birth defects of the heart and neural tube, and hormone-related cancers. It can also destroy people's livelihoods, wells, and homes, causing some people in Western PA to wind up homeless. It's also associated with worker industries and deaths, and these are particularly common among non-unionized workers in fracking. In Pennsylvania, gas wells are located primarily in rural areas, so the people affected by them tend to be white, low-income people. But in the Southwest, the people affected by fracking wells tend to be Black, Hispanic, and low income. The second part of the global production network is high pressure gas liquid pipelines. The newest ethane pipeline projects in Pennsylvania are the Mariner East 2 pipeline and the Shell Falcon ethane pipeline. They both transport ethane through very large pipelines that are highly pressurized. Mariner East is owned by Energy Transfer Partners, the same corporation that owned and operated the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery, which recently closed. Since the start of the Mariner East 2's construction in 2017, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has issued more than 60 violations and penalties of $12.6 million against Energy Transfer Partners for polluting wetlands and waterways and destroying more than 10 private wells in the building and operating of the Mariner East 2 pipeline. The Shell Falcon pipeline, which carries ethane 97.5 miles across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, is currently under construction. Much of it cuts through rugged, mountainous terrain where pipelines can't easily be laid in a ditch, and developers have to drill horizontally through the rock, which increases the chance of accidental releases of toxic drilling mud and fluids. Pipeline construction could be much more tightly regulated and better managed, but best practices are not required by federal or state agencies. The agency that handles the permitting of interstate transmission pipelines is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. Despite being directed by Executive Order 12898, which was signed by President Clinton in 1994, which directed them to consider environmental justice impacts in pipeline permitting decisions, FERC has failed to follow this and has not done so. They've been criticized also for considering a contract with a gas liquid supplier as proof that the pipelines are a necessary convenience for the public. Pipeline developers need to show that they are a necessary convenience so that they can use eminent domain to take the land of homeowners unwilling to allow a pipeline to run through their property. But both the Mariner East and Shell Falcon pipelines were built to transport ethane, which is not used for household heating and cooking, and the pipelines were large-sized transmission pipelines, not the smaller distribution pipelines that allow household access to gas. FERC has also been criticized for allowing developers to condemn and take private land before obtaining a permit for the pipeline, and also for conducting inadequate reviews of environmental impacts. Worst of all, public input into permitting is extremely limited. So the third sort of node in this global production network is ethane crackers and environmental injustice. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about exporting ethane, which is another environmental justice issue. Okay, so these are pictures of ethane crackers. The one in the top right-hand corner is the Monica, Pennsylvania Shell Pennsylvania Petrochemical Complex, which is currently under construction. So this is a huge ethane cracker that's being built currently in Western Pennsylvania. So these are large-scale petrochemical complexes that are also plastic resin factories. And as Corin mentioned earlier, the American Chemistry Council announced $200 billion in investments for new infrastructure for plastics manufacturing, including 6 new petrochemical plants planned for the Gulf of Mexico. By 2016, just 3 of these were in operation, but US plastics production had already increased 16% since 2011. So the Pennsylvania petrochemical complex that's currently being built has the capacity to refine 1.6 million tons of ethane into polyethylene per year. And of course, people living near these petrochemical plants face health and safety risks from fire, explosions, and accidents, as well as cumulative long-term effects of exposure to carcinogens such as benzene, hexane, and heptane, as well as endocrine disrupting substances used in plastics. Most plastic resin produced in the US is produced in the Gulf of Mexico region. Pennsylvania only produces about 3% of US plastics. Texas produces about 44%, and Louisiana produces an additional 7%. So most of the people who are living in these fence-line communities are poor people of color, a disproportionate number of them Black and Hispanic. But this is starting to change with the build out of more petrochemical complexes in Appalachia to process the ethane from the Marcellus Shale and Utica Shale formations. So poor white people are becoming a larger number of the people impacted by these types of facilities. Then finally, the end point of all of this is disposable plastic items. Plastics recycling in the US, the official rate for plastics recycling in 2017 was about 8.5 to 9%. So 8.5 to 9% of plastics in the US were recycled. But really only 50% of this was actually recycled. And if you, yeah, some measures count incineration as recycling, but I did not. So 50% of this is actually being shipped abroad. And on the left-hand screen, you see a picture of a huge pile of plastics in China, and they were banned in 2017. China banned imports of foreign plastic waste. And they were quickly followed by India, Malaysia, Poland, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. They all banned plastic waste importation. However, the picture you see on the right is Turkey. Turkey is now taking over as the importing company. So these plastics obviously are going to cause health and safety problems because they're not disposed of in any kind of environmentally benign way. In the United States, the plastics that can't be shipped abroad have to be disposed of here. While most are landfilled, 16% gets incinerated in facilities like this one. And what you're looking at is the Covanta trash incinerator that's located in Chester City, Pennsylvania. Chester City is in Delaware County. It's a poor waterfront community that used to be industrial. As of 2010, it was 75% Black or African American. And people in Chester have much lower incomes than the statewide average. A recent study showed that 79% of communities hosting incinerators like this one are poor communities of color. When plastic is incinerated, toxic air pollutants like chlorine, dioxins, and polystyrene are released into the surrounding air. And the ash residue from incineration is particularly toxic, containing high concentrations of heavy metals like lead, arsenic, and cadmium. So in conclusion, I've prepared 2 slides to talk a little bit about what needs to change. The first thing that should change is regulation and enforcement. We need to counterbalance the power of petrochemical industries by strengthening environmental regulation and protecting environmental injustice communities, by strengthening environmental enforcement also. So here's just a little bit of the policy changes that we would need. Here are the main ones. First, we need to ban fracking outright. And if that can't happen, we need to at least tighten the regulations around drilling practices. We need to close the Halliburton loophole that exempts gas drillers from the Safe Drinking Water Act. We need to revamp the permitting process for interstate pipelines, and we need to empower state agencies to better enforce existing environmental rules, particularly ones applying to petrochemical plants and incinerators. We need to make key jobs in the EPA off limits to industry lobbyists so that we can move forward with research on the toxicity of plastics. Finally, the US needs to shift environmental policy from an emphasis on recycling to an emphasis on source reduction. The emphasis on recycling made more sense in 1970 when plastics made up 2.4% of all US garbage. By 2017, they made up 13%. So focusing on recycling a product that cannot be easily recycled and for which there is no market for recycled plastics just doesn't make sense. Instead, the US should follow the EU's lead and ban the manufacture and sale of the top 10 disposable plastic items found in ocean pollution. This should be combined with a wider strategy of research into the health impacts of items such as plastic food containers, with a view to banning other plastic items that are the likeliest to have a negative impact on human health. So I'm not advocating that all plastics be banned. Instead, the most troublesome and unhealthy plastics should be banned. But of course, that would drastically reduce the demand for plastics. So it's going to be very strongly resisted by the industry. Okay, so that's the end. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Sicotte. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So, so audience, you're welcome to pop any questions into that Q&A box or raise your hand if you wanted to verbalize a question. And while you're thinking it through, I had a quick question for you, Diane. I was thinking about this a lot while I was looking into the link with plastics and climate change and just learning about how hugely responsible the plastics industry is for pushing this production of plastics. And I guess I get kind of caught in this blame game of like, and I'm very appreciative that you have those wonderful policy solutions for us, but I'm wondering how you think about it on the consumers end. How much responsibility do you think consumers have to reduce or reuse our plastic use, particularly thinking about these students involved in this case competition? They're looking at how to reduce plastics in the dining hall. How much responsibility is it for students to say come with their own plates or with their own utensils to a dining hall to help with reducing single-use plastics? It's kind of
okay, so how much responsibility should be on the individual versus the system?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that there has, Michael Carolyn is an environmental sociologist, and he calls what he thinks should happen virtual environmentalism. And what he means is it should be automatic, it should be easy, the system should be set up to promote it. So if our system is set up to promote buying and using plastics, then individuals can swim upstream, but ultimately they're going to be defeated by the system and very frustrated, as I am when I go to buy items and I'm not even told what they're packaged in. I don't even know what I'm buying. I don't even get a choice.
Right.
So if we banned certain items, then those choices would disappear and we would be choosing more sustainable items just automatically.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, right. The consumers sometimes don't even have the choice to make the right choice.
Yeah, I think it happens a lot in this country.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions coming in the Q&A, so I'm just going to read this first one off. From Alex, I wonder if it is worth considering policy and law at the state and local levels as well. For example, in Pennsylvania, the Robinson Township case allows for communities to ban fracking at the
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Alex already knows all about Act 13 and all the history there. That was finally sort of invalidated by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I think what we would need, though, if we're talking about source reduction, then state and local policies aren't going to be enough, because if we're inundated by a tsunami of plastic stuff that's being manufactured and produced and sold, then they'll be defeated by that policy. And also, our environmental laws were written at a different time in history, before this ramp up in disposable plastics, before globalization, before container ships brought us goods from other countries that had to be overpackaged in order to arrive unbroken. So the world has changed, but our laws haven't. And the federal level is always the best level to regulate, because some states are super conservative. So that's the other problem, is we've got great regulations in California, but how is Louisiana going to do? And how is Pennsylvania going to do?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we had tighter federal regulations, and like EPA's rule is you can have stricter regulations, but you can't have looser ones, then we could sort of pave the way for better state and local regulations.
These questions are a bit related, so I'll ask them together, from Katie and from Amanda. How can we motivate the upper echelon decision makers to implement these changes? And do you have examples? I guess Alex had the example of Robinson County. Do you have other examples of successful actions taken by cities and municipalities, or states and countries, to improve recycling or reduce plastic use?
Yes, some examples are some of the cities in California that have banned plastic. They started out banning plastic bags, and the plastics manufacturers actually used state environmental laws against them and sued them on the basis of environmental laws, saying that we don't know what the impact is going to be to paper bags. They could be even worse than plastics. And of course, nobody was talking about reusable bags, which was the whole point. So this got fought out in state courts, and finally the environmentalists won. And so now a lot of stores in California have a ban on plastic bags. And my mother lives in a town in California, and she has noticed a real difference when she's driving. There's much less plastic waste along the roadsides now after the ban. Of course, all of these are going to be resisted. Pennsylvania was supposed to ban plastic bags, right? There was an initiative to do this, but Governor Wolf begged that it not happen for another year, because they wanted to give the Beaver County big shell plastic petrochemical complex, they wanted to give them a chance to make money first. Again, here we go with problems with state regulation too, because governors are so much more susceptible to the pressure of industry than the federal government. But I think more and more cities are following California's trends and saying, well, we're not going to do this. We don't care what the state says. We don't care what the federal government does. We're not going to have it here. And of course, our state constitution says that we have the right to a safe, clean environment. So we do have that legal tool.
And I've heard of examples of, I think for example, in New York City have passed a plastic bag ban, which the state then passed a law saying that the city could not implement. So
Yeah.
there's examples of states kind of preempting local municipalities from passing bag bans.
Well,
And
I have to say though that I'm always angry when New York City touts how clean and green it is, because they get their energy from Pennsylvania, their dirty energy, and they also source their garbage to Chester. So 1/4 of New York's garbage is going up in smoke in that incinerator. So don't tell me how clean and green you are, New York. And
yeah,
I should say Philadelphia does the same thing, so our hands aren't all that clean either.
absolutely. I see the trucks, or not the trucks, the freight trains coming through with waste management from New York all the time along the Schuylkill River Trail. Okay, there's a couple of folks with their hands up I'm going to get to in a second. So kind of paralleling that question about what we can motivate our decision makers to do. There's also a question about like individuals and communities. What can we as individuals do? How can we motivate consumers to drive change? Do you have any suggestions on how we can motivate our communities, particularly those most impacted, to adopt non-plastic alternatives?
Um, well, I think one of the things that works is to just not just refuse. So when I go to a store and they want to hand me a plastic bag, I just say, no, thanks, I don't need a bag. And I bring my own bag. I have a cloth bag that folds up into a tiny little, like a sheet of paper. And I can bring that with me. I've used it probably 200 times. So, and it's still perfectly good and usable. So I'll probably be using that thing for the rest of my life. And so I don't know, if you go to stores a lot and you just bring a backpack or anything else that you can reuse, that's one thing that people can do. And then of course, just don't accept it. When they give you a plastic fork at a restaurant, say, no, thanks, I don't need this. You know, I have my own. Or, you know, when they want to sell you water in a bottle, just use a faucet and fill up your reusable bottle instead. I mean, I just got used to doing those things and they became automatic. And, but I guess as a sociologist, I focus on the group and the big collective picture. So I always remind my students that individual actions are important, but by themselves, they're not enough. You also have to engage politically in the fight to get rid of these plastics and to do things differently. And I see people doing that all over the place. Um, the fight for shareable bikes and all this other stuff, that's all happening too. So resisting this part of the fight is really, really important. And it has to be done at both levels. It can't just be local, it has to be national, state level, everything.
I'm going to let some of our attendees that have raised their hand talk. Roland, I'm going to allow you to talk, so you just have to unmute yourself and then you can ask your question.
Okay, because I had put on for the Q&A. I just was wondering about the role of grassroots groups, such as we've seen in Chester around the incinerator. You know, obviously that helps for the specific groups, the communities that are being impacted. But you know, in some respects, on these broader policy issues, does that just kind of move the problem somewhere else? Is there some way that these grassroots kinds of organizations could impact on a broader level on the kind of policy stand that you're talking about? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because we know in environmental justice that what happens is that wastes just get displaced onto a different community. So if one community resists a plastics factory, for example, this happened in Louisiana back in the early 2000s, it just got built somewhere else down the road. So I think the whole point is to stop the need for these factories to be built, to decrease the demand, to reduce this at the source. And that's not going to be an easy nut to crack, because in America, our politicians don't want to interfere with business or production. It's almost like a religion with them, you know. But if it can be proven that plastic is toxic, then we're kind of opening the door to some government reduction. And then if we can accomplish source reduction, then we don't have to worry about displacement, because there's not so much need to find a place to put the waste if there's not as much produced. So it's very logical, but in a way it's sort of like pie in the sky, because it's not like a practical, easy solution. But we've seen that the other solutions aren't working.
Yeah, thank you.
Kevin, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Hello.
Hi, Kevin.
I was struck by your the concept that you highlighted at the beginning of distributive injustice, and I often, when I was a student at Berkeley, would decline to sign the petitions for these environmental groups to prevent things coming out of Berkeley, or that would be proposed in Berkeley or locations nearby. Because, and I would say to them that, if this doesn't go here, it's going to go into another community that has less resources than Berkeley, and people will get mad at me. And so I guess that just makes in mind that if we can't have the ban of the production, which I'm totally for, I don't understand why we have plastic when we know we can't get rid of it. I just feel like, can we just say no plastic? And your banning of the tin sounds more logical or rational there. But if we can't do that, would you advocate us putting the petrochemical accounts around, moving them from not moving all of them, but distributing them into the wealthy or the more resource communities, and not just restricting them to the poor Black and brown and white communities?
Oh, well, I think there should be a law that if you own stock, or like if you own $1 million of stock in a chemical company, it got to go in your backyard, right? I wish that could happen. But the truth is that because we have housing inequality, because there's segregation, because there's structural racism, people of color are going to get dumped on more than white people, and poor people are going to get dumped on more than middle class and upper class people. And so in some ways, what we need is an end to, well, not just in some ways, we need an end to structural racism. And environmental injustice is not going to end as long as structural racism exists. And it isn't just racism, it's classism as well. So there's this intersectional injustice that it gets visited most on poor people of color. So we have to, in order to end distributive injustice of bads, we have to promote distributive justice of goods. So now we're talking about a realignment of distribution in society. And that's always the most controversial thing that you could possibly talk about. Does that answer your question, Kevin?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Diane.
Thank you, Kevin, for the question. We have a comment and a question that I'm going to read, and then we might wrap up with that. A comment from Jen, going back to the plastic bag question. Speaking of COVID, supermarkets were not permitting use of reusable bags at the outset of the pandemic, but was glad when we finally had enough data to understand that shopping bags were not a high transmission risk. And I think we're hoping the same with reusable water bottles, like that using a fountain to fill up your water bottle is not a high COVID transmission risk. Question though from Hugh, acknowledging that we can't recycle our way out of this problem, are there any actions, policy or economically driven that would increase the secondary market for recycled plastic? What are the barriers to the uptake of post-consumer plastic?
Okay, well, the biggest barrier is that plastic, there isn't just one plastic, there's plastics. So plastic goods are made of different formulations, and their chemical content is different. So when you buy one plastic item, it's not it isn't made of the same thing. So when it comes time to actually melt it down and recycle it, make it into something new, it can't easily be done because some plastics are too flimsy, they're too brittle. They cannot be made into items of similar value. So that thus there's no market for recycled plastic. There's a big market for recycled paper, glass, and metal. So all of those things can be recycled so well. But plastics, there isn't. So as a government, you would either have to mandate that plastics be made of certain materials that can easily be recycled. And even then, again, as Corinne pointed out, the energy use in recycling them and refashioning them, and they're always going to be toxic. They're always going to contain toxic materials. So I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to even try to recycle them sustainably. I think it makes much more sense to do source reduction and just say, okay, our society needs less of this because of these reasons. And it isn't just the recycling and it isn't just climate, it's also the toxicity of plastics, because there's so many substances in plastics. They can leach into food and water, and we don't know how they're affecting our health. So I think there's more than one reason to ban plastics outright, and not all of them, but just these certain categories.
Absolutely. Yeah, it just hearing the pile-on of all of these issues with plastic, the environmental injustice, the toxicity, the climate impacts, for like a plastic bag that you never even needed in the first place. It's just, it seems straightforward, but of course, there's a huge plastic industry behind it.
Yeah, there's power and there's money, and that is the reason it continues. That is the reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, Dr. Sicotte, I really appreciate your time and talking to us about these issues. Wonderful questions from the attendees as well. Thank you so much. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you again for your time.
Okay, thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye.